December 19th, 1944. The winds howled through the dense Ardennes forest as the first hints of winter's full wrath descended upon the men entrenched in the small town of Bastogne. A brittle, unnatural cold seemed to freeze time itself, suspending it in a moment of eerie silence. But the stillness was only the calm before the storm. The air was thick with anticipation. The Germans, numbering in the tens of thousands, were closing in on all sides. The fierce snowstorms and the claustrophobic landscape of the Ardennes were no longer enough to obscure the fact that the Allies were in trouble. Bastogne, once a quiet Belgian town, had become the focal point of one of the most crucial battles of the Second World War, the Battle of the Bulge. The town, sitting strategically at the crossroads of several vital supply routes, was under siege. It had been surrounded by German forces, cut off from reinforcements, its defenders facing the impossible. In the midst of the chaos stood Private Tom Reynolds, a soldier in the 101st Airborne Division. A young man from the American heartland, his face was weathered far beyond his 23 years. Tom wasn't a hero in the classic sense. He wasn't a general or an officer with grand schemes. He was a soldier doing his duty, just one of many who had been thrown into the furnace of war. But in that moment, as the Germans pressed in from all directions, he would become part of something much greater than himself. Bastogne had become a fortress, not by design, but by necessity. Its defenders, a mixture of veterans and young recruits, had been forced to dig in, their positions surrounded on all sides by an enemy intent on breaking their resolve. The town itself had become a symbol of resistance, a beacon of defiance against the might of the German army. But even the toughest men could feel the weight of the siege bearing down on them. Tom had learned the true meaning of fear in those days. The nights were the worst. Cold, hunger, and the relentless artillery fire made it nearly impossible to sleep. But it was the dread of the unknown that gnawed at him the most. Every rumble of artillery, every distant explosion, brought with it the same thought. Will today be the day we fall? Tom's eyes burned with exhaustion as he crouched in a trench, his rifle resting by his side. The constant bombardment made it impossible to keep track of time. Was it morning or evening? The world outside had become a blur of frozen mud and falling snow. But even in the midst of the chaos, there was one thought that kept coming back to him, a glimmer of hope, albeit distant and fragile. Patton, General George S. Patton. Patton had earned a reputation that stretched far beyond the battlefields of Europe. He was a commander like no other, ruthless, determined, and utterly relentless. His name had become synonymous with victories, and his reputation for breaking the most entrenched enemy positions was legendary. The rumors had started days earlier, whispered across the lines like a secret prayer. Patton was coming. His Third Army, one of the most formidable fighting forces in the world, was on the move. They were heading straight for Bastogne. But as Tom sat in the cold trench, he knew that Patton's arrival was not a guarantee of salvation. The Germans were closing in with every hour, tightening the noose around the town. The men holding the line were weary, physically, mentally, and emotionally drained. They were no longer fighting for territory. They were fighting for survival. And no one, not even Patton, could promise them that. Just hours earlier, the town's commanders had received a message from the German forces. They had demanded the surrender of the American defenders, offering terms that would have spared lives but condemned them to humiliation. The response from Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st Airborne, had been blunt and defiant. Nuts! It was a bold reply, a middle finger raised to the enemy. But it had come with a cost. Time was running out. The streets of Bastogne had turned into a battlefield in their own right. Each house, each alley, each building was a fortified position. The German forces, well coordinated and relentless, seemed to be everywhere. Tom could hear the rumble of tanks in the distance, the screech of artillery shells cutting through the air, and the crackle of automatic fire in the distance. But it was the silence in between that was the most unsettling. He looked down at the frozen mud beneath his boots, his breath rising in clouds of vapor as he tried to push away the cold gnawing at his bones. It was almost a relief when the artillery began to fall once more, for it at least gave him something to focus on. But in the back of his mind, the question lingered. Would Patton arrive in time? As the snow continued to fall, Coating the town in a thick blanket of white, Tom Reynolds braced himself for the next attack. The Germans would come. They always did. But this time, perhaps, there was hope. For in the distance, he knew General Patton's forces were on the move, and the clock was ticking. December 26, 1944. The tension in Bastogne had reached a boiling point. The relentless sound of artillery shells breaking through the air had become a constant, like an unyielding drum beat that never stopped. For the soldiers in the 101st Airborne, it was as if time itself had slowed, stretching every minute into an eternity. Every crack of gunfire was a reminder that they were surrounded, isolated, and desperately holding on. Private Tom Reynolds, still perched in a trench, could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His thoughts wandered back to his family in Ohio, his mother's gentle smile, his father's firm hand on his shoulder. He had never imagined that he would be far from home, in this foreign land, locked in a deadly struggle with an enemy that seemed to be everywhere. He had signed up for the war with a sense of duty, of pride, but now the reality was more complex. The thrill of serving had long worn off, replaced by exhaustion and fear. He wasn't fighting for glory anymore. He was fighting for the men beside him. His mind flickered to the men of his platoon. Sergeant John "Big" O'Malley, a burly, gruff veteran from Boston, had become something of a father figure to the young soldiers. O'Malley had seen it all, and his presence was a steadying force in the midst of the chaos. He had become a symbol of resilience, a man who, despite the horrors of war, continued to push forward, always putting the mission first. But even O'Malley wasn't immune to the strain of the siege. Tom had seen it in his eyes. There was something different in his gaze now, a weariness that went beyond the physical. It was as if he was carrying a burden too heavy to bear, a weight that threatened to break him. "Reynolds," O'Malley's voice rumbled from behind him, pulling Tom from his thoughts. "You see anything?" Tom squinted through the snowflakes, his breath fogging the lens of his rifle. Nothing. Just the frozen emptiness of the Ardennes, broken only by the occasional burst of distant gunfire. "No, Sarge," Tom replied, his voice low, almost reluctant to speak above a whisper. O'Malley didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared into the distance, his face drawn and tight with the weight of the decision that was beginning to gnaw at him. "You think we're going to make it, kid?" O'Malley's voice was quiet but edged with a kind of sorrow that Tom had never heard from him before. Tom didn't have an answer. He had been asking himself that same question every day, every hour. Could they really hold out until Patton's forces arrived? The Germans were relentless, and with each passing hour, their grip around the town tightened. The feeling of isolation was suffocating. They were cut off from the rest of the world, surrounded by enemies who were all too willing to destroy them. Maybe we're just waiting to die here," O'Malley muttered under his breath, his voice cracking just slightly. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from the veteran, and it made Tom's heart tighten in his chest. But before Tom could respond, a loud explosion shook the ground beneath their feet. A German artillery shell landed close, sending a shower of dirt and debris into the air. Tom instinctively ducked, the thud of the explosion still ringing in his ears. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, everything frozen in the aftershock of the blast. "Stay down!" O'Malley shouted, pulling Tom behind a nearby structure. They crouched low, the sound of the explosion still echoing in their heads. But as the noise faded, the sense of dread didn't lift. If anything, it grew heavier. "We can't hold out forever," O'Malley said, his voice low but full of bitter truth. "And Patton's not here yet. If he doesn't show soon, we're dead." Tom felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew what O'Malley was implying. It wasn't just the physical danger that weighed on them. It was the psychological strain. They were living in a state of perpetual fear, waiting for a miracle that might never come. Patton, their last hope, was still miles away, and every minute spent waiting felt like a nail being driven deeper into their coffin. In the coming days, the situation became even more dire. The German forces had launched another wave of attacks, their tanks advancing through the snow-covered roads, their infantry charging through the cold with relentless determination. The defenders of Bastogne, already weakened by the siege, fought back with everything they had, but the enemy seemed endless. In the midst of this chaos, another figure emerged, a medic named Corporal Helen Carter. She was a soft-spoken woman with a kind smile, but beneath that exterior lay an unyielding determination. A former nurse back home in Pennsylvania, Helen had volunteered to serve as a medic with the 101st Airborne. She had seen the horrors of war firsthand, but it hadn't hardened her. If anything, it made her more compassionate, more resolute in her mission to save lives. Helen had been moving through the trenches, treating the wounded, providing comfort where she could, when Tom first noticed her again. She was tending to a young soldier, his face pale, his body racked with fever, the telltale signs of frostbite creeping along his fingers. "We're running out of supplies," she said softly as she worked, her hands moving deftly. "If we don't get more medicine soon, we won't be able to help the others. And we're going to need more blood." Tom nodded, though the words hit him hard. There was nothing more they could do. They were trapped, just like the rest of the soldiers. Their survival had become a gamble, with time running out and the odds stacked heavily against them. It wasn't just the enemy they had to fear now. It was their own dwindling resources, their own fatigue. Helen met Tom's eyes as she finished bandaging the wounded soldier. "You've got to hold on," she whispered, as if trying to reassure herself more than him. "We have to." But even Helen's optimism couldn't change the reality of their situation. The German forces were relentless, and their attempts to break the American line had only intensified. As each day passed, the psychological toll of the siege began to wear down even the strongest of men. The soldiers in Bastogne were now facing a moral dilemma, a choice between survival and honor. The temptation to surrender, to end the siege, was beginning to rise. The cold, the hunger, and the endless bombardment made it hard to imagine holding out much longer. But somewhere deep within their hearts, they knew that surrender wasn't an option. Not with Patton coming, not with the sacrifices already made. But what if Patton didn't arrive in time? What if they had to make the decision to surrender in order to save their lives? The thought was unbearable, and yet the tension hung heavy in the air. The line between victory and defeat had never been so thin. Patton's arrival could mean salvation, but it could also be too late. As Tom lay in the freezing cold, staring out into the white expanse of the Ardennes, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The Germans were pushing harder than ever. They were getting closer. And Patton, well, Patton was still a distant hope. He had to arrive soon. The waiting was killing them. December 23, 1944. The air in Bastogne had thickened with the kind of tension that only comes when hope is running out. The Germans, relentless as ever, had launched another attack, this time with more fury than before. The ground shook under the weight of artillery shells. The smell of burning wood and twisted metal filled the air. The remnants of buildings, once whole, now nothing more than splintered ruins. The town had become a battlefield, its streets no longer streets, but trenches and rubble. Time seemed to stretch infinitely, every minute an agonizing battle for survival. Private Tom Reynolds sat in a foxhole, his body tense, his breath shallow as he gripped his rifle. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt warmth. The cold had seeped into his bones, turning them to ice. His mind raced with thoughts of his family, memories of the life he had left behind. But they were fading, slipping away under the weight of the war. The sounds of combat, the constant rumble of German artillery, the crackle of machine gun fire, had become the soundtrack of his life. It was late in the afternoon when it happened. The Germans had breached the outer defensive perimeter of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne, already stretched thin, was now facing an onslaught from all sides. The town had been surrounded for days and supplies were running low. Food was nearly gone. Ammunition was running out. The men had been fighting for so long, it seemed impossible that anyone could hold on much longer. And yet they kept fighting. Each man, a symbol of defiance against the enemy. But there was a limit to how much even the bravest could endure. Tom's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp yell. "Reynolds, get your ass over here!" It was Sergeant O'Malley, his voice ragged but filled with urgency. Tom's heart raced. It was the call he had been dreading. Without thinking, Tom sprang to his feet and sprinted toward O'Malley's position. The sounds of gunfire and explosions faded into the background as he moved. When he reached the sergeant, he saw that O'Malley wasn't alone. Corporal Helen Carter was there too, her face pale with fear, her hands trembling as she held a field radio in her arms. "They've breached the western wall," O'Malley said, his voice strained, almost resigned. "It's bad, kid. Real bad. We can't hold them off much longer. The perimeter's collapsing." Tom swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. Every second felt like a lifetime. "What do we do?" Tom asked, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't just the physical danger that scared him. It was the crushing psychological weight. They were running out of time, and the stakes were higher than ever. "We're going to have to make a choice," O'Malley replied, his gaze intense. "The Germans are coming from the east now. If we don't stop them, Bastogne's gone. But we don't have the strength to keep fighting like this. If we don't pull back, we'll be wiped out. There's no way out." Tom's mind raced. A retreat. It was the only logical option. But the thought of surrender, of giving up what they had fought so hard for, gnawed at his insides. The very idea seemed like a betrayal. To his comrades, to the men who had died, to the mission. But O'Malley was right. They couldn't keep fighting like this. They had no choice. But then, there was the glimmer of a possibility. The words hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope. "We've got one shot," O'Malley continued, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and determination. "Patton's close. I've been getting reports. We make it through the night, and he's going to break through and relieve us. We just need to hold on, hold out until he gets here." Helen looked up at them, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. She had been through enough of the horrors of war to know the price of survival, but she wasn't about to let her men fall without a fight. "We can't let them break us now," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "We have to hold, for the men who didn't make it this far, for the ones we've lost." But there was something else in her eyes, something Tom couldn't quite place, the flicker of doubt. They all felt it. The tension in the air was suffocating, thick with the knowledge that nothing was certain anymore. Patton's forces might not make it in time. The Germans could overrun them at any moment, and if that happened, they would all be dead. Every second counted. Tom looked at O'Malley, who seemed to be waiting for him to make a decision. The sergeant had always been the one to lead, the one who kept them together when everything seemed to fall apart. But now O'Malley was looking to him for guidance. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Tom's heart beat like a drum in his chest as he made the impossible choice. "I'll stay," he said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty that gripped him. "We hold. We wait for Patton. We don't give up. Not now." O'Malley nodded, a hard, proud smile creeping across his face. "Damn right we hold. Let's make it count." But as the decision was made, Tom couldn't shake the sense that something else was at play. The cold, gnawing feeling of something slipping away, like sand through his fingers. The enemy was closing in. Patton's arrival was still uncertain, and the weight of their survival was no longer in their hands alone. The battle raged on through the night, louder and fiercer than ever. The sounds of artillery, the roar of tanks, the screams of men in combat filled the air. The soldiers of Bastogne dug deeper into the earth, refusing to give up. But every explosion, every rumble of the earth beneath them, seemed to tear away a piece of their resolve. And then, in the distance, there was a new sound, something they hadn't heard before. The deep, rumbling roar of a tank engine. It was faint at first, barely audible over the cacophony of battle. But it was there. The unmistakable sound of an approaching force. It was Patton's tanks. But the Germans weren't far behind. Tom gripped his rifle tighter, knowing that the fight was far from over. The final decision was coming, and it would come down to this: hold or surrender, live or die, victory or defeat. In that instant, Tom knew that everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in, would be tested in the coming hours. There would be no more hiding from the truth. The battle for Bastogne was about to reach its climax, and Tom Reynolds would be at the center of it. December 24th, 1944. The night had fallen like a thick blanket over Bastogne, and the fighting seemed to intensify with each passing hour. The relentless sounds of artillery fire and the steady thrum of German tanks rumbled through the air, shaking the earth beneath them. The defenders of the town, tired, hungry, and battered, had reached the very edge of their endurance. The cold was unforgiving, and with each explosion that rocked the ground, it became harder to differentiate between the pain of the body and the weariness of the soul. Private Tom Reynolds crouched in a makeshift trench, his eyes scanning the night. The harsh glow of distant explosions illuminated the horizon, casting long shadows that danced like specters across the snowy fields. His fingers, stiff with cold, gripped his rifle tightly. The air smelled of burning wood, cordite, and the metallic tang of blood. The Germans were still advancing, inching closer, their infantry and tanks pressing from every angle. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, Tom could hear it, the unmistakable roar of engines. It was faint at first, but it was there, rising above the thunder of battle like a distant promise. Patton's tanks. The sound was like a prayer answered, the last thread of hope pulling the men together. But even as they strained to listen, another explosion rocked the ground. The earth trembled beneath them, and the world seemed to warp, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The Germans were not backing down. They were relentless. And though Patton's forces were on the horizon, Tom knew that they might not arrive in time. "Reynolds!" Sergeant O'Malley's voice cut through the noise. Tom turned to see the big man crouching in the shadows, his face grim but resolute. "We don't have much time. We've got to hold until they break through, or it's over." Tom nodded, but a sense of dread crawled up his spine. The time had come. They had made their choice to hold. But now, as the battle raged around them, the question was no longer about if they could hold. It was about how much longer they could last. Suddenly, the trench shook again. This time, the explosion was closer. A piece of debris struck the ground near Tom, and he ducked instinctively, his heart pounding. The sound of enemy machine guns rattled the air, cutting through the snow like 1,000 knives. "Fall back!" O'Malley barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "We can't hold here anymore. Move!" Tom's heart sank. He had never seen O'Malley act this way. His usual steady, unflappable demeanor was gone, replaced by desperation. And Tom knew that if the sergeant was giving the order to retreat, it meant that all hope was almost lost. But then, just as they turned to make their way back, a new sound pierced the chaos. A distant rumble, a wave of sound that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Patton's tanks. The ground shook again, but this time, it wasn't the sound of destruction, it was the sound of salvation. A massive column of Sherman tanks appeared at the edge of the horizon, their dark silhouettes cutting through the blizzard-like conditions. The tanks, their guns roaring, began to push through the snow-covered fields, cutting down anything in their path. The Germans, momentarily thrown off balance by the unexpected onslaught, faltered. For the first time in days, Tom felt the weight of hope settle in his chest. Patton's forces had arrived. They were here. The siege was over. But the battle was far from finished. With a sudden, jarring shout, O'Malley turned to Tom and grabbed him by the arm. "This is it, kid. We push forward, now or never." Tom felt his heart race. They couldn't stop now, not when the Germans were reeling. His body felt heavy, his muscles burning. But the surge of adrenaline was like a jolt of electricity. He gritted his teeth, his rifle ready, and followed O'Malley as they sprinted through the maze of destroyed buildings. The sound of the tanks grew louder, and with it came a wave of soldiers, American infantry charging alongside the armored column. The streets of Bastogne, once choked with smoke and debris, became a chaotic battlefield once again. Only this time, it was the Germans who were on the back foot. But the cost of victory was clear. As Tom and O'Malley charged forward, they passed bodies. Bodies of men they had fought alongside, men who would never see another day. The price of survival had been steep, and Tom knew that many of his comrades, perhaps even O'Malley, might not make it out of this battle alive. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the madness of war, there was a fierce, unrelenting determination in the air. They would not let Bastogne fall, not today. Just as they neared a cluster of German soldiers retreating in the streets, the ground exploded beneath their feet. Tom felt a searing pain shoot up his leg, his body collapsing onto the cold, wet ground. His breath caught in his throat as he gritted his teeth against the sharp sting of shrapnel embedded in his flesh. "Reynolds!" O'Malley shouted, his voice panicked. But the explosion had thrown Tom into a daze. His vision blurred, his hearing muffled by the ringing in his ears. He tried to push himself up, but his leg wouldn't move. Blood soaked through his uniform, and he knew, deep down, that he couldn't continue. The pain was unbearable. but there was no time for it. O'Malley was shouting for help, but Tom knew it was too late. He had already made his decision. He had chosen to stay, to hold, to fight for his comrades. And now, even in the face of death, he would not back down. With a last, desperate effort, he pulled himself up and stumbled forward, using his rifle as a crutch. He had to keep moving, had to keep fighting. The tanks were now pushing through the streets, their guns roaring, the German forces in full retreat. "Go!" O'Malley shouted. "I'll cover you!" But Tom shook his head. He couldn't let his friend die alone. He couldn't let them all die for nothing. They had come so far, and now Patton's forces had broken through. It was time to finish what they had started. In that moment, as the battle surged around him, Tom made the ultimate sacrifice. He turned not to save himself, but to save his comrades. With a final, determined shout, he hurled himself into the fray once more, covering O'Malley and the others as they continued to push forward. It was the last thing Tom Reynolds would ever do. The battle raged on, but the German forces were finally breaking. The Americans had held. And though Tom's sacrifice would never be forgotten, it was the courage of every man who fought that day, every soldier who refused to give up, that secured victory for Bastogne. As the Germans retreated, Tom's final words echoed in the cold night air. They did it. The battle for Bastogne was over. The town that had been a symbol of defiance against the German offensive now stood as a testament to the resilience of the men who had held it, and the courage of those who had come to their aid. Patton's forces had broken through the German lines, and the American soldiers had emerged victorious. The Germans, now in full retreat, had left behind a shattered town, but the hearts of the soldiers who had fought there were not broken. But for Private Tom Reynolds, the victory came at a terrible cost. The pain in his leg, once a dull ache, had grown worse with every passing minute. Blood had soaked through his uniform, and as he stumbled through the streets of Bastogne, the world around him began to blur. He could hear the shouts of his comrades, the rumble of Patton's tanks pushing through the streets, but it all felt distant, as though he were watching it from the outside. "Tom! Tom!" It was Sergeant O'Malley's voice, distant but insistent. O'Malley had been there when the explosion had thrown him to the ground. He had been the one to shout at Tom to stay down, to save himself. But Tom hadn't been able to, not when the men who had fought beside him were still out there, still fighting. He had made his decision long before the blast, when he chose to stay, to hold, to fight, no matter the cost. And now, as his body struggled to stay upright, he felt that decision more than ever. Every step, every movement was a battle against the pain, but there was no turning back. The world around him was slipping. The edges of his vision grew hazy, and the sounds of the battlefield faded, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold, hard ground, unable to move any longer. O'Malley and the others were shouting, but Tom couldn't hear them anymore. His mind was drifting, far away from the horrors of war, far from the battle that had cost him so much. The pain was overwhelming, but there was something else too, a strange sense of peace. He had given everything for this moment, for his comrades, for his country. And though his body had been broken, his spirit had not been shattered. He had fought, and in fighting he had found a purpose greater than himself, a purpose that transcended the violence, the chaos, the bloodshed. And in that moment, lying on the cold ground of Bastogne, Tom knew that the sacrifice had been worth it. They had held, they had resisted, they had won. As the battle wound down and the town of Bastogne began to quiet, the soldiers who had fought so fiercely gathered to regroup, to mourn their dead, and to take stock of what they had lost. The German forces were retreating, and the town had been saved, but there was no joy in the victory, not for the men who had paid the price. O'Malley was one of the first to reach Tom. The sergeant, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief, knelt beside the young soldier. His hands, stained with the dirt and blood of battle, gently lifted Tom's head. "You did it, kid," O'Malley said, his voice breaking. "You held on. You saved us all." Tom's lips curled into a weak smile. The words were comforting, but they didn't feel like enough. He had held on, yes, but it had cost him everything. And now as he lay there on the ground that had been both his prison and his battleground, Tom knew that he was not the same man who had first stepped into the fray. The battle had changed him. The war had changed him. As O'Malley looked down at him, his eyes filled with both sorrow and admiration, he reached out and placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "You're a hero, kid," he whispered. "You did more than anyone could have asked." Tom's eyes fluttered, his vision fading. He wanted to say something, wanted to tell O'Malley that they had all been heroes, that the real victory had come from the men who fought together, who stood side by side against the darkness. But the words wouldn't come. The weight of his own body was too much, and he let go of the fight. As he closed his eyes, a final thought flickered in his mind. A thought not of victory, not of the battle, but of the simple things. His mother's face, his father's quiet smile, the warmth of home. Those memories, the ones that had driven him forward, the ones that had kept him going when everything seemed lost, were with him now. They were all that mattered. The darkness of death descended, and Tom Reynolds, private, soldier, hero, slipped away, his sacrifice woven into the tapestry of Bastogne's history. The town of Bastogne was a shattered shell, but its defenders had held. The German forces had been repelled, and the American soldiers, though scarred, had emerged victorious. Patton's tanks, which had arrived just in time, had helped turn the tide. But it was the courage of the men who had held the line that had won the day. In the days that followed, as the war continued to rage across Europe, the story of Bastogne became a symbol of resistance, of bravery, and of the unbreakable bond between comrades. Private Tom Reynolds, along with the other men who had fallen that day, became part of the legend of the 101st Airborne, their names etched into the history of World War II. And while the victory was sweet, the cost was undeniable. Thousands had fought and died, each of them contributing to the ultimate goal, the defeat of the Nazi regime and the liberation of Europe. But for those who survived, the psychological scars of the battle would linger long after the guns fell silent. Tom's story, like so many others, was one of sacrifice, and it was a reminder that victory in war often came at the highest cost.